First of all, I want to thank you all for the invite here to talk to you all. And you know, these user groups and these user cons are one of the most interesting things for me to be able to come out and talk to people about. I spend a lot of time talking to customers. I know many of you are customers of VMware, but I spend a lot of time talking to customers. But in these situations, I get an opportunity to make sure I'm also, many of you are practitioners. You actually use our products every day. You dive in and try and figure out, how do I expand them into different areas? How do I leverage them? And that's a great conversation for me to have, to understand what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what are some of the opportunities we have to be able to address some things, and you know, a little bit about where you think we should be going with some of the technologies. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about just the VMware big picture, the vision, where we see things. You know, we talk about cloud, we talk about edge computing, kind of stitch some of that together. I'm going to dive a little bit into the edge computing side, purely because I had to make a choice of maybe one area to go into, and I decided to go into that area. And then we have a bunch of question and answers, which I'm happy to go into any of the other areas if you've got interest in those as well. Or anything just about the company or what I'm seeing in terms of interacting with customers. So let me dive right in. This is a weird slide, and it's deliberately a weird slide, right? Because I've been at VMware 16 years. My first job at VMware was running what was then the VMware storage team. So we were focused on building VMFS, figuring out how to do device drivers for storage devices, figuring out how to connect to large storage infrastructure, which probably none of you use anymore, things like IBM Sharks, big heavy EMC storage systems, and we were leveraging how do we connect to those. And in some ways the biggest challenge was our initial product was essentially what you think of today as Fusion, what was then Workstation, right? Which is, it runs on laptops. It doesn't talk to big iron storage. We don't worry about, you know, huge networking infrastructure working with Cisco and others. Suddenly we moved into this enterprise space, and it was like, oh, this is kind of difficult. You got to make sure everything runs every single day. You got to make sure that we deal with all these standards, different partners, ecosystems, and so on. And storage was one of the more interesting spaces in that, partially because very soon after I joined, we got acquired by EMC, which then created a very interesting ecosystem dynamic with the rest of the storage business. And we can talk about that a little bit, because those dynamics still exist in different ways, now with Dell partners and so on. I can talk about that a little bit later if you wish. Anyway, bottom line is, most people still view VMware as a virtualization company. That is the core of what we do. That is what they say, it's in your name. VM is in the beginning of your name. You're a virtual machine company, right? The story, though, is actually quite different. If you look at their story today, and I'm sure you've seen this picture, I'm just going to dive into some components of it, right? But if you look at this picture today, the small blob which represented compute is somewhere buried in the hybrid picture in this space. And this represents, broadly speaking, everything that VMware does today from a technology point of view. And this picture has been fairly consistent for the last maybe 5 to 6 years, with some changes in the last year. Probably the biggest change occurring in the bottom section of the picture. If I recall, maybe 2 years ago, it just said private cloud or some equivalent in that. It might have said SDDC, I can't remember. But it was basically data center infrastructure and how do you work with that. And then over the last year or so, it morphed into these 4 separate cloud areas. And when we look at this morphing has been driven very much by what we are seeing in terms of the shifts that customers want to make. And the biggest shift we got was customers saying, I want to be able to leverage cloud. Now, what was interesting, they didn't necessarily say, I want to leverage Amazon or I want to leverage Azure. And they didn't even necessarily say, I want to leverage a place where I run my infrastructure. What they were really after was a kind of an experience. It was an experience that says, I'm looking for elasticity. I'm looking for someone else to be able to take care of running the infrastructure of the data center itself. I want to be able to focus on the applications. And so what you're really seeing here was a shift in how companies began to look at the role of IT in their organizations, where IT was historically an organization. It takes care of back office stuff. They make sure the email works. They make sure the accounting works. They make sure, you know, people get paid online. All of that stuff works correctly. Now, as many of those companies have shifted into being digital companies, the role of the IT technologist begins to change, because now it is a fundamental part of the business of the company itself. And you hear all examples of this. You know, Uber is a software company that manages transportation, or you know, Airbnb, they don't own any apartments, but they handle a whole lot of bookings around the world. So what happens is the companies have moved into this digital space, and it has affected every single company. Whether I talk to banks, whether I talk to, you know, agricultural food producers, more and more and more, their decisions are being governed by how do I leverage this digital infrastructure. And that caused this flip to occur that says, I need to worry about the competition. I need to worry about, am I putting all my effort in the right place to make my company successful? And the right place is building digital infrastructure, building applications that allow me to interact with my customers, with my employees, with my partners. And that's where the IT organizations need to be able to focus. During that same period of time, when I look at the people who we sell to, go back a few years, the person in the meeting room with us was a CIO and maybe a VP of infrastructure or head of IT. Invariably, that same meeting now has a bunch of application developers in there, or a team which is focused on developing the applications for the company. So you're seeing a shift in that space. When we looked at that, we made, we tried to figure out, okay, how do we make sure to solve this problem for our customers, this idea that they want to be able to have this cloud-like experience. Now, some companies originally would come to us and say, we're moving 100% to the cloud, we're shutting down our data centers, we're going to run everything in the cloud. Other companies would come to us and say, this scares the crap out of me. I've got private information, and you're asking me to put this in a public cloud? You know, I like some of the stories that you're telling about this, but you know, this just scares me. I've got regulatory and legal issues why I cannot do some of these moves. So we fairly quickly came to a decision that we thought there is going to be the existence of what we call the hybrid cloud. And that was actually not an obvious kind of thing to conclude, because go back a few years, there was a very strong sense of a race to the public cloud. So we saw this strong sense of hybrid. Most of the major cloud providers have now come to the same decision. Now, we come at this from a major private cloud provider saying it's going to be hybrid, how are we going to work with the public cloud? Most of the big public cloud providers come at it from a direction that says, I'm a major public cloud provider, how am I going to build hybrid by working with the private cloud? And probably the strongest example of that is what we've done with Amazon, and I'll talk to that in a second. Actually, yesterday, I was just looking at this morning, so I probably don't have all the facts right, but Google Next is on back in the Bay Area at the moment. It was on yesterday and I think today. And you know, a lot of what they were talking about was what is the best way to bridge from a public into a private cloud, including the availability of some Google services in private cloud infrastructure. Actually, they made a number of announcements with VMware in that space as well, particularly around some of what's going on with PKS, the container Kubernetes side of things, and also what's happening with some of the things we're doing with networking. But we see this clear trend. It's going to be hybrid. Nearly everybody's on that same page at this stage. It is not just a journey or a transition point. We believe it's going to be a stable end point. You're going to be dealing with multiple clouds and on-prem infrastructure. Most organizations are going to be doing that. So that was maybe the key change that we saw in that. The other key change that we saw was the usage of public cloud in its own native public cloud fashion. That is causing some interesting challenges for companies. Some recent surveys have shown that most companies are expected to be leveraging as many as 7 public clouds. I don't quite buy that, because I think what they're including in that is things like SaaS services, Office 360, et cetera, right? But the bottom line is there's going to be at least 2 or 3 public clouds that you're using. And then that begs the question of, how do I arbitrage across these? How do I work out the economics? How do I make all of that something that's manageable and easy to use? And so our focus around that was to build management layers across that public cloud layer. So you see VMware sort of going in 2 directions in this space. One, I really want to be able to build a hybrid cloud. I want to be able to use existing applications, and I want to be able to leverage public cloud assets, almost in a way that says the new infrastructure is not my x86 PC from Dell and my PC from HP and my storage from Dell or EMC or IBM. Yes, that's important to me, but now the new infrastructure has all of that plus an available public cloud. How do I now bring all these together in a way that makes some sense? And that's what we primarily call that hybrid cloud story. And then the other direction, or the other layer we're focused on, is given the fact that I'm going to have multiple public clouds, how do I now manage and give cohesive stories to those? So you see us buying things like Cloud Health, right? Which focuses on my management across all of those. Those shifts and those decisions have been the most fundamental change we've had in the last few years. We've done lots of other things, but if you look inside VMware, the way we develop software, the way we deliver services, the way we produce those services, the way we sell and charge for some of the products is fundamentally affected by this change. And again, happy to dive into what that looks like behind the scenes. But if you wanted to know what it's like inside VMware the last few years, it's been dominated by this, this story. It's basically the bottom level of that box there. I want to comment for 1 second briefly, and I'll come back to Edge in a second, but what's happening in telco. For a long time, we saw telco cloud as basically telcos wanting to enter the cloud business. They would build cloud infrastructure, they would offer it to their customers. What's actually happening now is something different. Telco is being built on cloud, built on virtualization more and more. So what you're seeing is the large telco operators are saying, I want to be able to leverage virtualization, to be able to take compute and other infrastructure out to the edge, because I believe when 5G becomes a much more prevalent model, that we're going to be able to need that for flexibility. So more and more of the infrastructure is being virtualized. Initially, most of this was done on Openstack. Now much of it is done on what we call VMware Integrated Openstack, which basically gives you the stability and the enterprise story for the core hypervisor, your storage and your networking, but gives you Openstack layers on top for the ability to be able to plug in your own open source components and so on into that mix. But more and more we are seeing that emerging as a key area for us. I would say it's one of the fastest growing areas, not the fastest. The fastest is probably what we're seeing with VeloCloud and what we're seeing with vSAN, but it's a fast growing area for us. And then finally, Edge, I'll come back to that in a second, so I'm going to ignore it for now. So if you look at this picture, and I want to just dive in maybe a little bit on some of the products that we see. So first of all, if you look at the public cloud area here, the emerging products in this space is basically cloud delivered services. The most prevalent that you're talking about is what we do with VMC on AWS. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but just to echo one of the key components of this, it takes VMware infrastructure, it runs it on Amazon infrastructure. That itself is interesting. The really interesting part, though, is that VMware manages that infrastructure. So you're getting much more of a true cloud experience, but you're able to do it using your VMware infrastructure. Applications which worked on your VMware infrastructure before, relatively easy to port over into this environment. In fact, I should say migrate over. You typically don't change code or anything like that to make that happen. Now consider the ease of what I've just described there versus a model that says, I've got an existing application. It's the database that runs my hospital and everything associated with it. Now I need to be able to move that to a public cloud such as Google or Amazon. I'm going to rewrite it all using containers. I'm going to rewrite it all using Kubernetes. That is a multi-year project minimum. Whereas using this model, you can relatively easily move your existing applications and leverage a lot of the cloud features that you want. Somebody else managing it, elasticity, I can scale up and down, I pay for what I use, I still have access into the same cloud services if I want them by going outside that VMware enclave and back into some of the native cloud services if I want to do that. So it gives you a relatively quick route to be able to say, I can really get into cloud, begin to leverage those advantages, and then, or in parallel, I can look at what new applications do I want to develop in that space. We'll come back to the applications in a second. I spoke about this, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, except to point out the phrase VCF, which is VMware Cloud Foundation, which in some ways represents a collection of most of the products you probably use today. vSphere, vSAN, NSX, vRealize, brought together into essentially a solution. Okay, that's interesting, but what's, again, really interesting about it, that's almost the exact same software that runs over on Amazon, on VMC, and AWS. That is almost the exact same software that runs on many of the cloud providers, so OVH out here. It's almost the exact same software running on those cloud providers who are leveraging VMware infrastructure. And because of that, you're getting a consistency, a reuse, a ability to be able to leverage this technology across many, many different environments. And all of that is described in this block, which we call VCF. In fact, even some of the hyper-converged infrastructure, where you take products like VxRail, which is the vSAN compute story that we work with Dell. If you take products like VxRail and you take a few of these, you can run VCF on top of this, you've created basically VMware Cloud Foundation leveraging those building blocks. Essentially the same software being used over and over again, because we believe in that consistency, you're going to get a lot of flexibility. One of the other areas that we see is this thing called project dimension. This essentially says, I've just figured out how to run VMware over in Amazon. I figured out I'm going to deliver it as a service. But what I'm really doing is I'm managing VMware infrastructure on a bunch of servers in Amazon. Why can't I manage a bunch of servers not in Amazon, back in your data center? That's all Dimension does. It takes that same management component, which manages the infrastructure in Amazon, reaches into your data center and does the management over there for you as a service. Once again, it's VCF based. You're seeing a common pattern showing up in those spaces. I didn't spend much time on this part when I was talking about the public cloud, but everything I've described so far is a strong infrastructure leaning to it. But remember, I pointed out, more and more of our customers have an application team sitting right in there as we're beginning to talk about how this works together. And going back a few years, that was very confusing. I had lots of different container technologies. I had stuff from Google, I had stuff from Docker, I had orchestration technologies coming in from a myriad of different companies. Over the last few months, so basically the last year, this has settled into a somewhat stable situation. And the stable situation is decided by and governed by Kubernetes. It is emerging as the single core orchestration layer that we see across much of this, what we would call cloud native infrastructure. And so we have begun to put significant focus in this. Probably to get a sense of our focus on this, a few months ago we bought Heptio. Heptio, if you're not familiar with the company, if you dig into Kubernetes, you'll be familiar with the founders of Heptio. Two of them were were the original builders of Kubernetes over at Google, and they were focused on how do I take this infrastructure and make it available to enterprises. Sorry, take this orchestration software and make it available to enterprises. And so VMware acquired that company just at the end of last year, and we're now beginning to integrate much of what they do as part of our broad application story. Most of this is covered in a group of products called PKS. There's PKS Enterprise, there's Cloud PKS, and so on. But broadly speaking, it's the ability to, how do I build cloud native applications? One of the things which I personally am, how can I put it, negligent in when I talk about VMware. My background at VMware has been almost primarily focused on infrastructure. How do I make vSAN better? How do I make the compute faster? How do I figure out how we're going to manage all of these things, right? But in practice, a very significant and growing part of our business is around how do you manage end user workspaces? And that is captured by a group of products called Workspace ONE. And some of you may be familiar with these, but broadly speaking, what this is, it says, I can protect your mobile device, I can manage the identity on that device, but more importantly, I can present a workspace such that as you move from device to device, I make it easy for you to be able to access common applications. So as a manager, all the time I'm approving stuff and looking at HR things and figuring out what the travel policies are and what am I doing, going places and so on. More and more of that I do on my mobile device. But behind the scenes, I'm accessing a bunch of SaaS applications. If I had to keep logging in, if I had to keep running those applications on top of the mobile device, it would just be a pain in the ass. What Workspace ONE does, it brings these things together into that unified story. And in some ways, this is a reaction of us by our customers coming in and saying, yeah, we manage all this infrastructure stuff, but the infrastructure just changed. It's now all mobile devices, it's laptops, all of these things. Help me do that. And that's where we come into that mix. So there's some things that we see emerging in the mix as well. We've got telco NFV. I've spoken about that a little bit. We're seeing an emergence of edge IoT. I'm going to dive into that in a little bit more detail in a second. But we're also seeing some fundamentally new things. Blockchain is one we are particularly interested in because we as an engineering team have a lot of strength in what I would call hardcore systems engineering. We know how to build distributed systems. We know how to worry about things. How does the storage and the networking interact in all sorts of interesting ways? As people begin to build blockchain applications, and I'm not talking about Bitcoin or anything like that. I'm talking about, banks being able to say, how do I have a decentralized trust approach to how will I trade or send money between the different branches and so on. Well, as they begin to build those, they want to focus on the application. I want a cool new application that lots of users log into and they can trust it because of using blockchain behind to assert that certain transactions taken place. But the blockchain infrastructure itself is a pretty difficult systems problem. How do I audit it? How do I back it up? How do I know the state of the overall blockchain? How do I make sure that it's running in a way which is efficient? How do I know, has it been compromised in some way? And so a lot of our focus is building a core blockchain platform to allow those applications to build on top of that. Most of this we do in open source. If you want to grab this or take a look at it, the key project in this space is Project Concord. And a lot of it is available in open source. So broadly speaking, what we're also seeing as we if I look at a macro level trend is, we're seeing a desire to leverage HCI, hyperconverged infrastructure. Once again, that goes back to the very first statement I made. Customers are telling us, I want someone else to take care of the nuts and bolts of the integration. I want someone else to take care of the nuts and bolts of making the infrastructure works. I want to focus on the layers above if at all possible. We're seeing a strong focus on a desire to build cloud operations teams. Very, very consistent across what we're seeing different organizations. This one is a little bit maybe surprising to me. We're seeing an emerging desire to use SaaS management for my infrastructure. My reason why that's a little bit surprising to me is because when I go back a few years, I'm never going to let my data out of the data center. I'm never going to let someone manage this stuff. That is beginning to shift. We're beginning to see some changes in this. One of our fastest growing products is VeloCloud, SD-WAN infrastructure. VeloCloud is a company we acquired, so now there's an NSX VeloCloud combined product, which is essentially managed infrastructure from the cloud in terms of how do you manage your SD-WAN infrastructure. Very, very fast for us. We're seeing the same on products like some of the VRA functionality where you monitor your infrastructure and then that now being delivered as SaaS applications. The implication for VMware and the implication for our customers is that we now have many products which begin to exist in a dual mode. License it, build it, put it on-prem, leverage it as a SaaS service of some sort. You'll be able to getting these two dual modes occurring. And more we're seeing demand for the SaaS mode. And then the other major area we're seeing is, of course, what I mentioned, applications or application developers as a key part of the purchasing and buying cycle. I wanted to maybe take a step back and look broadly some of the other things we are looking at. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm putting the slide up because it might trigger questions if you've got a particular interest in one of these things later. I am going to dive a bit deeper into 5G, but I want to comment on maybe one or two of the others. Hardware acceleration is actually one that's emerging quite interestingly for us at the moment, because I just had all those discussions about SaaS and cloud and application development and Kubernetes. We still get a lot of core requests for, I simply need my compute to run faster in my data center. I want to be able to run a complicated machine learning or AI workload. I'm doing HPC. How do I begin to bring that together and leverage that into the mix? And more that is using non-traditional x86 infrastructure. Typically, I've got a server of some sort, and then I've got accelerators there within that. The obvious accelerator is people using GPUs for doing machine learning or AI, but we're also seeing people wanting to leverage FPGAs, where they can reprogram specific pieces of an algorithm into an FPGA and then leverage that across their infrastructure. The challenge for us is we like to pour software across your infrastructure to hide the details. We don't care necessarily where, who built that server or what the firmware is, et cetera, et cetera. Now you're suddenly beginning to change that story by creating effectively customized infrastructure. And so we've had to do quite a bit of work at the core of ESX to be able to support those. The GPUs, GGPUs, that's already released in our products, particularly with a focus on NVIDIA, where you can do things like a broad management across all of that infrastructure using your normal VMware tools. And in-house, we've got quite a bit of focus going on some of the FPGA side of that. The FPGA one has all sorts of interesting side technologies, because we ourselves want to be able to leverage those FPGAs potentially to be able to do some interesting things with respect to I/O, memory management, as we begin to work into those systems. The other area here we're seeing, which is not really a hardware acceleration, but is a hardware change that is occurring, non-volatile memory. Servers with large amounts of non-volatile memory, we're seeing these beginning to appear, and we want to take advantage of those, obviously for things like vSAN and so on, but also it fundamentally changes how you write applications. Think of a typical application you wrote over the last 10, 15 years. A lot of it is based on a POSIX stack. I open files, I write to files, I put something in an array or some storage, I write to an object or to a file, I come back, I pull those out and process them later. A lot of the code is focused on handling that part of the chain. When you actually look at this infrastructure with these new large amounts of non-volatile memory in the mix, I don't need much of that code anymore. It fundamentally changes how I would build that database. And we're more and more looking at what is the impact of that from a virtualization point of view. I will come back to some of those if you want to later in the Q&A. I do want to focus a little bit on just one narrow space, the edge. The reason why I'm focusing on this is twofold. One, it means different things to different people. Can I just check my time? Because it's not. I'm good? Okay. Okay. I want to be able to focus on this area because, one, the edge means different things to different people. And what we are seeing is a lot of questions around edge compute, IoT, what is the best way to build and leverage these? Now, I'll also be clear to you. We are also seeing that this market, which has promised to be this super large, fast-growing market, is still predicted to be a super large, fast-growing market, but it seems to be about 2 years behind where the original predictions were being made. And that's just not me saying that. Some of the larger analysts are saying the same sort of thing. And there's challenges in making some of these moves, because I've got my existing infrastructure. What's the risk reward for me to go in and change a production line? There better be some good reason to do that. What's the risk reward for me to be able to modify a ship or a train or something in that space? So all of that is then merging into that mix. So what we've got here is the emergence of this new focus of compute. And in the end, it's all about where is the data coming from. The data is being generated at the edge. So I've got devices, we say, measuring temperature. It may well send that to the cloud. That's fine. That's one way of doing this. But more and more, you're seeing I need to actually be able to process the data not in the cloud because I've got real-time constraints or I've got legal constraints. I'm not allowed to take an MRI image from a person in a hospital and randomly send it over to Amazon in another country. You're not allowed to do that. There's rules about that. Now, I can potentially send results because I've hidden all the personal information, but I need to determine those results, and that requires significant compute. And so we're seeing the emergence of this edge compute story. So broadly speaking, use cases are things like IoT, then doing things like machine learning and local inference right there at the edge, doing data analytics at the edge, automation, and then there's a lot of an emerging story around business continuity. If I build infrastructure which relies on a whole bunch of sophisticated compute at the edge, if that fails, it's not that the payroll was a couple of days late, which is obviously a disaster if you're expecting your payroll, or it's not just that the email didn't get delivered today, it took a few hours to get there. The actual factory goes down. And that is very significant. It's the source of production and wealth for my company. And because of a failure of a single x86 PC, I bring that down. That's unacceptable. So you have a lot of focus on how do I secure that infrastructure in case of hacking and so on. And you've also got a lot of focus on what is the best way to be able to say, how do I make sure that's continuous? So what we see here is the drivers are reducing the execution time. I have a real-time component in the mix. I've got network costs or limitations. Go back to those MRI images. It's expensive to send those back to the cloud and suck them back down if I need to be able to do that. So instead, can I do all of that locally? So we have seen this strong emergence of a push towards edge computing. I mentioned earlier on this Project Dimension. Project Dimension essentially says you will put compute into your factory, into your vehicle, train, ship, whatever it is, into your building for building management, and then the management of that comes in from the cloud. This area here is actually one of the most interesting emerging compute areas we are seeing because it introduces a level of focus on security, a level of focus on business continuity, a level of focus on all of the things that you as IT professionals have had to worry about for the past 30 years. But now suddenly a whole new group of people need to worry about the same thing. The people who manage buildings, the people who manage the factories. And I think one of the challenges that you face is to make sure how can I interact and work with these people? Because they are now connecting a $5 sensor with an Ethernet connection to it right into the heart of your data center. And if you're not aware and able to manage and deal with those things, you've got some challenges in the mix. So what you see emerging is essentially a, sorry, the graphics didn't render quite right here. What you're seeing here is essentially this, I guess, architecture associated with the edge. You're seeing right at the edge itself what I would call physical edge. These are things which are reading data from sensors, managing and manipulating them, right? What you see above that is a new layer of compute, which we call edge compute, typically hyperconverged infrastructure. This would be the 4 or 5 computers living in a rack at the back of a major conference center like this, or they are the 4 or 5 computers living in a naval ship which are controlling infrastructure of that ship, but they're not actually directly connected to the sensors themselves. They're doing that compute. Project Dimension fits in that. Then you begin to see, oh, I need to worry about the whole networking side of this and the connectivity of this. How do I get secure access into that factory, into that building? And I use SD-WAN and 5G to be able to do that. And finally, I jump up to cloud to do the analysis and data on that. This stack is what we see as emerging as this new stack. So when we think about this activity at the edge, I've described this model of taking data, working it through this chain of events to the cloud. We're seeing the opposite occurring as well, taking cloud applications and moving them back out to the edge. One of the examples of this is the Amazon RDS running on VMware infrastructure. Second example of this is some of the work we've been doing with Microsoft, where we take Microsoft cloud services and running them on IoT infrastructure, infrastructure at the edge. Actually, there was a demo given recently on this by Chris Wolf, actually at another VMUG, where he demonstrated leveraging a Mellanox networking card, a SmartNIC, running this infrastructure right on the card and having it all integrated through the whole chain. So you're now getting VMware into a very deeply kind of embedded story here. And all of that is directly tied into what's going on with IoT. You know, in the interest of time, I'm not going to dive into this. The key highlights here, I think, are just what are the things that we're looking at in this new cloud-to-edge story. One, we want to give you methods to migrate workloads and data to the cloud in a way which is safe for you as an enterprise. We know that you're going to want this scaling elasticity. That's why you see products like VMC on AWS. We know that you're going to need to unify those multi-cloud operations, products like Cloud Health and everything associated with that. And we know that you are going to want to rewrite some applications using containers, using Kubernetes, products like PKS in that mix. The final thing I just want to point out is I've used words like change, innovation, agile, scale, cloud, all of those sort of things. But the key thing that we focus on is actually helping customers make that change in what I call an enterprise pragmatic fashion. Most of our customers are banks and hospitals. They cannot go out there and say, hey, let's try this new cool piece of cloud software and let's see how it integrates into the rest of my story. Patients die, ships fail to move, planes fail to be able to take off because you're not able to get airspace or whatever cleared. Real business critical things occur. So a lot of our focus is helping people embrace these technology in what we call an enterprise pragmatic fashion. That's all I have in terms of going through this prepared set of slides. I guess we're going to a question and answer session. Thank you.